Okay, this is a little how-to video on how to answer question 5, the 16-mark essay for the Depression, War and Recovery unit. Okay, so this question, first of all, is assessing how you evaluate interpretations. So it's those interpretations are constructed deliberately after the event. So this particular one, we can see we've got the interpretation here. It's quite a short one, and it says, how far do you agree with this interpretation of the impact of women's contribution to the war effort in World War II? So they usually start, how far do you agree with this interpretation? Then they make it specific, okay? Or it could be to what extent do you agree with this interpretation. Now, before we look at this one in particular, if we have a look at the band descriptors, and this is what the examiner will use to see what they actually want and what we've got to answer, what skills we're looking at. First of all, we can see the 60 marks, 4 of them come from your AO1, which is your knowledge and understanding, okay? 12 of them come from evaluating and judging the sources and really, the interpretation, sorry, and really picking that apart, okay? So that needs to be quite heavy on that there. So the 4 marks, and we can see the differences in the bands here. So if you're not really supporting and giving relevant context, it's very basic. If you've got some relevant knowledge and understanding in there, then you get 2 marks. If it's detailed knowledge, you get 3. If it's very detailed, then you get 4. So this is where you need to be quite specific with the knowledge that you're going to be using to support the interpretation, okay? So the AO4 then, which is evaluating interpretations, it's really looking at how was the interpretation constructed and why did the person reach this view, and how, what is the purpose of it, what's the intended audience. So it's the same skill actually that you used when you did your non-examined assessment on Jack the Ripper for part 2. Okay, this is the exact skill we were looking at there, okay? How and why are interpretations constructed, and you really take it apart, okay? So we'll look at that in a moment when we get onto that part. So first of all then, the first thing you need to do when we're looking at that is have a look at what the interpretation actually says. So let's read it. We can see first of all it's from a GCSE Modern World History for Excel. So we're looking at a textbook published in 2010. Okay, we'll come on back to that in a minute. Let's look at what Steve Waugh and John Wright actually say then. So women played an important part in the Second World War. Remember, we're looking at the impact of women's contribution to the war effort. So they were important, particularly in their contribution to the armed forces, the army, their work in heavy industry, farm work and transport. This, however, made little difference to the status of women in society in the years that followed the war. Okay, so we've got there little different to the status afterwards, okay, years that followed. So what we need to do then is very, very briefly, we need to state what the interpretation is actually saying, okay? So this is where, for the success criteria here, we've got to briefly summarise the interpretation. Don't spend ages just paraphrasing, okay? You're not going to get any marks for it. We just need to get it clear. So what we could say then, first of all, is that the interpretation says that women were an important part and made a very important contribution to World War II, but this didn't affect their status after the war, okay? It didn't improve things later on. So now what we need to do, and obviously this would be in a full sentence, I'm not going to write it all out to us, we'd be here all day. The next thing that we need to do then is to support this with details from your own knowledge, okay? So this is given the context, okay? The context of what was happening. So if we look on here, this is where we get our AO1 marks, okay? So we're going to support it, and then that shows us then how far we agree. So to some extent we agree with the interpretation because we agree that women did play an important part. So let's see, this is very similar to question 2, where we're looking at what is accurate and what can we back that up with our own specific historical knowledge. Okay, so first of all, women working in the armed forces. We know that women did work in the armed forces. If you have a look at things like the ATS, the Auxiliary Territorial Service, okay, so you can give specifics that they were mechanics, that they were drivers. Even Princess Elizabeth, okay, our now Queen, she drove the Red Cross vehicles and was a mechanic there. Okay, so even if she had to do it, that suggests that it was really important. You've got the women also worked for the Women's Air Force as well. Okay, they would refuel the planes. Okay, so there's just some specific examples there of women working in the armed forces. You also had the Women's Navy as well, that you could mention there. Their work in heavy industry, that can be supported. That's basically talking about women in factories, isn't it? Okay, so we know that by 1943, 57% of all workers in factories were women. So clearly, women's work was very, very important during the war. So we can mention there what types of factories. So they were in aircraft factories. Those women who worked in the aircraft factories worked very, very long hours, 16-hour days, 7 days a week. So their contribution there was vital to getting these planes and these Spitfires up into the air, okay, to help win the war. You've also got women in munitions factories making weapons. You've got women in all sorts of factories. You've got women welding, you've got women making ships. Okay, so that's where we'd add that detailed information there to support that idea. Then we've got farm work, so particularly there to show your own knowledge, just use key terms as well. We're looking at the Women's Land Army. Okay, that they were growing the food necessary, okay, that we needed for the war. So they often came to places like Wales to do that as well and to work here. There was also the planting of trees and forestry work as well. This was really hard work, but it was vital to keep feeding people and to keep the farms running during the war as well. Okay, if we look at transport, okay, we've mentioned the mechanics for the ATS, we could mention those there. You've also got women drivers, women driving buses. You've also got women on the railways, working for the post office. And we also mentioned shipbuilding as well. So there we've got some information, really specific information on each of those. We don't want to talk too much about it, but the more specific information and keywords like Women's Land Army, ATS, key information like this in the factories is really going to show the examiner that you have got very detailed knowledge and understanding of the key feature in the question in order to get those 4 marks. Okay, so that's where we support it and we say, well, we do agree with this, or I do agree with this interpretation because this is accurate. I know this. From my own knowledge, I can back this up with this information. Okay, so that's given the context. So that's the AO1 where we get those 4 marks. The next thing we need to look at, where we get 12 marks from, is a possible 12 marks, is now looking at how and why this interpretation. Okay, so we've mentioned that we agree with the, we agreed with the interpretation on the impact of women's contribution because we've talked about what it actually says and that we can back that up with our own knowledge. Now we need to have a look at the author, we need to have a look at the type of interpretation it is, its medium, if you like. We also need to look at the context of it, the time in which it was published, its intended audience, to see if that affects how far we agree with it. Does it affect the validity of the interpretation? Okay, so first of all then, if we start having a look at the author, now these men here, we can see they're writing a textbook, so we could assume that they are historians or teachers of history. Okay, so a historian, we would assume, should have done, this is a keyword you can use if ever there's anything done by a historian, that they've done the appropriate amount of research. Okay, we will assume that they've done the appropriate amount of research. Writing in 2010 as well, if we take that context into consideration, there would be a wealth of information and research available to them, okay, to help them do that. So they'd be able to also see what had happened with women since 1945. They're writing here for up until 1951, but they should really be experts on having a look at what happened afterwards, because they're writing in 2010. Okay, so that's where the context comes in, becomes important there. So that's looking at the author and then why we trust them. If we have a look at the next thing we mentioned author, context. Okay, the next thing to have a look at is the audience and the purpose. And within that as well, I would also say is to have a look at the medium of it. And I'll tell you how I'm going to put that wording, because it'll help us with an acronym to remember this later. The medium of it, okay, is what is this interpretation? What does it form? Is it a book? Is it a film? Is it a radio broadcast? Is it a part of a museum? Okay, what actually is it? Is it part of a blog and newspaper? Okay, this one we can see, because it says GCSE Modern World History for Edexcel, we know Edexcel is an exam board, it's clearly a textbook. So the medium of it being a textbook helps us to understand that the audience are GCSE pupils, okay, pupils like you. So how does that affect the interpretation then? Okay, now it could be, and this is no disrespect for anyone sitting GCSEs, we all did them, it's a GCSE textbook. It's not a book for A-level student, it's not a book for those in university doing a degree, it's not a postgraduate textbook. So it may well be simplified, okay, for this purpose. So we could say there that the intended audience makes me a little bit less likely to agree with it completely, because it may be rather simplified and not really look at the whole situation based on the target audience of the book. It might be a limited perspective and it could be simplified or relatively generalized. So we could put, if I just put these words out here, because of its intended audience being students, it could be limited, it could be simplified, it could be generalized. Okay, so perhaps it does need to be a bit more balanced in that respect. If we consider then the purpose then, being a textbook, is clearly to inform and to educate. So in that respect, that makes it more reliable and more likely there to agree with it. Okay, so it's always linking back to the question, remember, how far do you agree? So you're just making sure that you put how far do these things affect whether you agree with the interpretation. There is an opportunity, if you wanted to, if the interpretation is quite polarised there, is to bring in other interpretations, but the question doesn't necessarily ask you to do that. It's asking how far do you agree with this interpretation. Okay, you could mention that this is part of a wider debate. Okay, we could recognise there is a debate over women's contribution to the war effort, and that this interpretation is just part of that wider debate, and there are other interpretations out there, okay, that may think differently and may think actually that the women either weren't as important as this suggests in those areas, or that it actually made a difference afterwards. Okay, so it is part of the wider debate. Then, very importantly here, you need to give a judgment. So you need to say, overall, do you agree with this interpretation? Okay, you are likely to, sorry, I'm making this away now. You are likely to partially agree with this, or to somewhat agree with it, or mostly agree with it. Because the intended audience might make this generalised, okay, because it is a very small piece and it is in a GCSE textbook, it might be overgeneralised. So therefore, we would mostly agree with this interpretation because our own knowledge supports what the interpretation says. But also we have to take in the consideration that perhaps a more detailed, if this was written for a university student or for a postgraduate, then perhaps this interpretation might be more detailed and we might be more likely to fully agree with it. Okay, so that would be for this specific one. Just as some hints, when we're looking at the medium or the type of interpretation, where this interpretation is coming from, it really does pay attention to this. This one is quite easy because we can see that it's a textbook. I have seen some others recently looking at them where they've mentioned the Oxford history of blah, blah, blah. When we look at things like the Oxford history of this and that, if you think about where you've seen those before, generally you've got Oxford dictionaries or encyclopedias or thesauruses. So you're looking really here at a reference book. So again, a reference book is going to contain lots and lots of history, specifically if it doesn't give you dates as well, or it's a wide amount of history involved in there, then maybe that would be overgeneralised as well. If, on the other hand, it is to commemorate and it's maybe something written in a newspaper years later to commemorate what happened in World War II, then that's likely to be reliable. But those things are more likely to be one person's experience of it. And if it's one person's experience, we won't assume that they are lying or anything like that. But it does mean it may not be typical of everyone's experience, and therefore we wouldn't fully agree with the interpretation, particularly if they miss bits out, miss some other features out, say of evacuation or experience of bombing in Swansea or something like that. Okay, so it is important to have a look at what it actually is in order to see what the intended purpose and the intended audience is. Okay, so as I said, with this, always think back to when we did our non-examined assessment on Jack the Ripper, and that should help us then really pick this apart. Is there anything it doesn't include as well? Okay, so in summary, to help with this a little bit, you've got some success criteria to help you remember how to do this in the exam. Okay, this is an important part now. I would say for context, in fact, we're getting another piece of paper here. Let's cover it. Drawn all over. I would say here you would need to include the context. That's where you get your AO1. Okay, your own knowledge. Then you would include the author. Okay, I would also put in medium there, so you do look at what type of publication or broadcast this has come from. Okay, you then would talk about the purpose. Okay, what was it for? What was it intended to do? Okay, that then links in with the audience as well, because the audience who is intended to should tell us a little bit about the purpose as well, and the medium will help do that. And then you also need to give a judgment, an overall judgment. Okay, so go back to the question, how far do you agree with this interpretation and why? Okay, so to help you remember that, if we have a look, we've got the word camp there. So camp AJ, okay, camp AJ should help you with the interpretation question. We're looking at World War II, aren't we? So let's think of it as a World War II camp. Camp AJ is a World War II camp, and that should help us with those interpretations on question 5. Okay, good luck.